Time now for our 10-minute interview. I hope it might even be a bit longer than 10 minutes with Esther Delbourg. You're a water economist with the Ecole Polytechnique here in Paris. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Now, in the lead up to COP21 talks on climate change, which are going to be held here in Paris in December, we talk an awful lot about reducing our carbon footprint, about reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, which is thought to be responsible for climate change, one of the main gases. But we talk a lot less about the water footprint, which nonetheless is extremely important. If I understand rightly, if we don't get to grips with using our water a bit better, then we're going to have serious water shortages in the future. Is that right, Esther?
Yes, that's completely right. So what you have to know first about the water footprint is that it's a fairly recent tool that we have. The water footprint, let's say, of production is the amount of water that you need to produce an amount of good. So, for instance, we know that we need an average of 16,000 liters of water to produce just 1 kilo of beef.
Pardon?
So yeah, the numbers are always very impressive. So that would be regarding production. And then we have the water footprint of consumption, which is what we actually consume, the water that is embedded in our food. So on average, we consume 3,000 liters of water per day. But that's an average, and that's a rich average, let's say. The US, for instance, have a very, very high average because they have a lot of water-intensive food habits. They have a lot of meat, they have a lot of processed food. In Europe, our water footprint is going to be a bit less, and you can guess that in very water-scarce countries or in countries where they have very different food habits, their water footprint of consumption is much lower.
So here in France, for example?
So in France, we're around a world average of 3,000 liters, which is good, but you have to understand what it means. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing whether you consider the water footprint in France, in Europe, or in the African continent, or in Southeast Asia. And let me explain why. We consider the water footprint as the amount of water needed to produce a good. The thing is that depending on weather conditions, on how much technology you have, how much know-how, you use the water differently according to countries. So in France, we're going to be very water productive, meaning that with a liter of water, we're going to do much more than what we can do in other countries where they have less access to technology, meaning that to produce the same good, for instance, in rural regions of India, they're going to use much more water to produce the same thing as we do. So what happens is that their water footprint is very high, but not because they're eating as much or even more than we do, but because they're not using the water properly.
Right. What about on the African continent? Of course, we have a lot of listeners in Africa. Africa is associated with drought, water shortages. What's their footprint like?
So the water footprint of African countries is ironically close to ours because of this problem of misuse of the water. Now, I think that for the African country, it's very important to say that there's a huge potential for water there. We're always associating Africa as a dry continent, but it's not at all.
Really?
There is a problem of infrastructures. So let's say, first of all, there's the water that you drink. So that's the water you need to live, and you can't do anything without it. In Africa, there's really far enough for people to live. People shouldn't die of thirst, or people actually shouldn't die of water diseases. The problem in Africa is that the investments don't go where they should go, meaning going to the proper water infrastructures. Regarding agriculture, it's another story. Two things. There's a lot of water underground, and there's a lot of transboundary river basins, very important in Africa. The problem is the way they're managed. People don't necessarily have access to the water, even though they should, either because there are sort of water tensions, where water gets grabbed by this or that country, or because it even gets, in a sort of way, bought by foreign countries. So now you have a lot of foreign countries, let's say China, Saudi Arabia, or even South Korea, going to Africa and actually buying the land. And when you buy the land, you actually buy the water that's underneath it. So they buy the land to produce food that goes straight back into their country. We call that a bit pejoratively, we call that land grabbing, but it's a sort of water grabbing as well. And so the problem is that there's plenty of water. It's a question of how you use it and who we use it for, actually.
So just to pick up on this idea of using our water resources better, you mentioned, eating beef, for example, which is very heavy on water consumption. What are you advocating then? That would it be better if we were all vegetarian, if we stopped producing meat? I guess that won't go down very well with pork farmers in Brittany, but
well, yeah. Well, that's so. It's always the problem of we want to enhance our management of water. We want to save water, but we should not forget that our first aim is for people to live and to have enough food to survive. Yeah. So there's two things. First, saying that we should all go vegetarian is a bit harsh, and I think it's not just possible. So I won't say it because it's not viable in a short term or even medium term. The reality is that beef is very water intensive. If you want to save water, have pork or have chicken, or if you really want to save water, go vegetarian. But the thing is, we should first learn how to use less water to produce the same things, so we can be more water productive with our beef or with our chicken. It's just that we need the proper tools. We need to monitor the water we use. We need to be careful even with the seeds that the beef will eat, which are very water intensive. Right. These seeds should already be monitored in terms of water production. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that mostly Western countries should take a look at their eating habits. The fact that, we're very happy to go to supermarkets and find every kind of product very cheap. But in the end, that's not sustainable at all. So I won't tell you to stop eating meat, but maybe you should eat less every week and start looking at where it was produced and try to consume it from places where water is efficiently consumed.
Right. And what about something like the humble apple? Here we are. This is French, by the way.
Okay, great.
How much water was involved in making that apple grow?
Well, let's say that for an apple that's around 150 grams, you need about 120 liters. So the figure is impressive because the apple is very small. Sure. And you can imagine, I have the figure for a glass of apple juice. A glass of apple juice is around 230 liters. So you can imagine that's why our consumption of water every day, of virtual water as we call it, is around 3,000 liters per day. So I would advertise, from your personal point of view, if you, as a consumer, if you want to be careful with the water you're consuming, then try to consume as local as possible, or try to consume from places where logic will tell you to produce it. It's always about producing the right crop at the right moment and at the right place. So perhaps very water-intensive let's say avocados shouldn't be produced in very dry regions of the world. Yet they are, because it's economically very profitable for companies to go there. The labor is generally cheap. Governments give free access to their lands to those big companies that bring back our products in our Western countries. So yes, try to be more ethical in the way you consume. But I believe the true revolution won't come necessarily from people consuming, but
it has to be producing. And it has to be surely imposed also by states. What do you think governments have to do to, in inverted commas, encourage people to make better choices in terms of the products they buy? Well,
that's the question that everybody's trying to see. So first of all, there are basic things that we should do. First of all, the problem is not the same everywhere. So if we're in rich, developed countries, generally we have water. We can cope with water scarcity because we have all the necessary resources and we store the water. So basically in our countries, in Western countries, it's about storing water, being careful about pollution, being careful about waste, about leakage, and encouraging a more sustainable way of consumption. That would be in our countries, and perhaps investing in all sorts of water-saving technologies because we have the capital to do so. If you look at developing countries where water is often scarce, then first thing that the government should do is try to install institutions that take care about the water. So institutions meaning property rights to the water. Who has it? Who can use it? Where should it go? Being sure that the water doesn't virtually escape the country for our sake, but that people don't at the same time starve and at the same time produce goods that go to France or England or anywhere. That's the first thing. Second thing is go into technology. We need water-saving technology to produce food. 80% of the water we use worldwide is for agriculture. So and when we talk water issue, we're talking food security issues. So that's the second thing, using technology to save water. A third and very essential thing is that generally in economics we say that having a price to something drives us to use it more efficiently. So water doesn't have any price, and that's a very complicated issue.
Yeah, because it's considered to be this thing that we all should have free access to,
exactly.
A fundamental human right.
But that's because we're always mixing the fundamental human right to having water to drink and the right to having water to produce something. So water as a factor of production is not the same thing as the water you should drink. The water you should drink, I agree, human right, and I couldn't say we should put a price on it. But the water to produce avocado or meat is an economic good, and therefore it should be priced.
Yeah, there's a choice to be made. You don't have to buy an avocado, you don't have to eat beef. Right?
Exactly. Plus, I mean, people working on farmers have a salary. You wouldn't imagine putting a farmer and not paying him or anything. So it's the same for the water. We're using it, we should pay for it. The question is that water is a very local issue, so having a global price wouldn't make any sense because the price has to be relative to water availability. So in France, there's a lot of water, so the price wouldn't be the same as if I were in a very scarce area where every liter of water would be, very economically useful.
Would you be in favour of having some kind of water tax put onto food products if they came from a country which had very low water resources? Would you be in favour of slapping a tax on those products to discourage people from buying them?
Well, that's if I was only thinking about water, perhaps, but economically speaking, this would not be good at all because we're talking about countries who generally lack capital or technology and have to use their water to produce food. So if I were to put a tax on Kenyan tea, that would mean that Kenyan farmers would probably go completely broke and would lose their jobs. And that's not what we want. I mean, there's water, but there's people first. Yeah. So I guess it's not a question about tax, it's a question about locally, Kenyan regulation, for instance, should look into how farmers are retributed for their work they're doing. They shouldn't sell the tea at such a low price. That's true. Or they should get money for the fact that we're using their water.
Now, as we move towards the COP21 talks on climate change, how much interest is there in these kind of questions, the things we've been talking about?
Well, the question
very
is that,
briefly.
Well, it's always about carbon emissions. You have to think of them as being a global good. Once they're emitted into the air, everybody feels them. Water is a very local issue, and that's why it's much more difficult to address it at the COP21.
Esther Delbourg, water researcher, thank you very much for joining us here today. It was very interesting. That's all we've got time for today. We'll be back with more news at 1800 hours Paris time.